He was one of 9 children growing up in a small house in Elmira, New York, a mid-sized city in the southern tier that most Americans could not find on a map. His father was a watchmaker who earned a modest wage and stretched it across a family that was always one unexpected bill away from real hardship. He had dyslexia so severe that school felt like a daily exercise in humiliation, and he graduated near the bottom of his class with no academic prospects and no obvious path forward. At 18 years old, with $150 borrowed from a friend, he opened a small jean shop in a basement. It went bankrupt. He tried again. It went bankrupt again. He moved to New York City with almost nothing, spent years doing freelance work that nobody remembered, and then, at 33 years old, he got one chance to put his name on a billboard in Times Square alongside the most respected designers in American fashion. Almost nobody in the industry thought he belonged there. Within a decade, they had no choice but to admit he did. This is the story of how a boy from Elmira, New York, with no money, no connections, and no formal training, built one of the most recognized fashion brands in the world. If you are new to this channel, welcome. If this kind of story is what brings you back, hit the like button right now, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Now let us get into it. Thomas Jacob Hilfiger was born on March 24, 1951 in Elmira, New York, the second of 9 children born to Richard and Virginia Hilfiger. Richard Hilfiger was a watchmaker, a skilled tradesman who worked with precision instruments for a living and who provided for his family through steady, careful labor rather than ambition or entrepreneurial risk. Virginia ran the household and raised 9 children in a home that was full of life but never full of money. The family was not destitute, but they were permanently close to the edge of what their income could support. And the children grew up understanding instinctively that there was no safety net beneath them and no inheritance waiting ahead of them. Whatever they built in their lives, they would build themselves. Tommy was not an easy student. Dyslexia made reading difficult and comprehension slow, and the educational system of the 1950s and 1960s had little patience or infrastructure for students who learned differently from the majority. He sat in classrooms where the material made little sense to him despite genuine effort, and he absorbed the quiet message that struggling academically communicated in that era that he was not particularly intelligent and was unlikely to achieve anything that required sustained intellectual work. That message was wrong, but it was delivered consistently enough and early enough that it settled into him as a kind of background assumption about his own limitations. What school could not teach him was the thing he was actually good at, the ability to look at the world around him and see possibility where other people saw only what already existed. Growing up in Elmira in the 1960s, Tommy was acutely aware of the gap between what his family could afford and the clothing he saw in magazines and on television. He was drawn to clothes in the way that some people are drawn to music or to sport, not simply as something to wear, but as a language, a way of expressing something about who you were or who you intended to become. He spent hours studying the style of the people he admired, breaking down why certain combinations worked and others did not, developing an eye that was entirely self-taught and entirely his own. He could not have explained the rules he was learning because the rules had no names yet. He was simply paying close attention to something that most people treated as an afterthought, and that attention was quietly building the foundation of everything he would later create. By the time he was in high school, the counterculture movement of the late 1960s was rewriting the rules of American style in real time. Bell-bottoms, see peasant blouses, fringe, denim, the entire visual vocabulary of that era was being assembled on the streets of cities and college campuses by young people who were rejecting the conformity of their parents' generation and building a new aesthetic from scratch. Tommy watched that movement with the intensity of someone who recognized that something important was happening and wanted to be part of it. He was not a political radical or a social activist. He was a kid from Elmira who understood that the clothes people were wearing in 1968 and 1969 meant something, that they were a statement, and that there was a market in that statement if someone had the sense to see it. If you are enjoying this story so far, now is a great time to subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and share this video. There are more stories like this one coming, and you do not want to miss them. In 1969, Tommy Hilfiger was 18 years old, newly graduated from Elmira Free Academy, and without any clear plan for what came next. College was not a realistic option given his academic record and his family's financial situation, and the conventional path of finding steady local employment held no appeal for someone whose imagination had already taken him somewhere else entirely. What he had instead of a plan was an observation. He had noticed that the clothing young people in Elmira wanted, the bell-bottoms and the jeans and the counterculture styles that were dominating youth culture across America, was not available in any local store. Elmira's retail options were traditional and conservative, yet built for the generation that had preceded the cultural upheaval of the late 1960s. Tommy saw that gap and decided to fill it. He borrowed $150 from a friend, drove to New York City, bought 20 pairs of bell-bottom jeans from a wholesale supplier, brought them back to Elmira, and sold them out of the back of his car. They sold immediately. He went back and bought more. Within a short time, he had enough revenue to rent a small basement space in downtown Elmira and open a proper store, which he named People's Place. The shop carried the kind of clothing that defined the era: jeans, peasant tops, leather goods, candles, incense, and the accessories that were the visual language of youth culture in 1969. It was not a sophisticated retail operation by any measure, but it was exactly what the young people of Elmira were looking for, and they found it quickly. People's Place was successful enough in its early years that Tommy expanded. By the mid-1970s, he had grown the concept to 7 stores across upstate New York, a remarkable achievement for someone who had started with $150 borrowed dollars and no retail experience. But expansion created problems that 18-year-old Tommy had not anticipated and that 20-something Tommy did not yet have the business skills to solve. Managing 7 stores required operational discipline, inventory control, cash flow management, and financial planning that went well beyond the instinctive retail sense that had made the first store work. The 1970s brought economic turbulence to the United States, with inflation and recession squeezing consumer spending across the country, and People's Place, which had been built for a moment of cultural enthusiasm rather than for long-term economic resilience, could not survive the pressure. In 1977, People's Place filed for bankruptcy. Tommy Hilfiger was 26 years old. Everything he had spent 8 years building was gone. The stores closed, the debts were settled for what they could be settled for, and Tommy was left with the experience of having built something real and watched it collapse, which is a different kind of education from any other. He had learned things about retail, about product, about what customers wanted and why, that he could not have learned any other way. But he had also learned, the hard way, that creative instinct without operational discipline is not enough to build a lasting business, a lesson he would carry with him for the rest of his career and apply in ways that the bankruptcy itself had made necessary. After the bankruptcy, Tommy made the decision that would ultimately determine the course of his life. Rather than stay in Elmira and rebuild within the limits of what a small upstate city could offer, he moved to New York City. This was not a comfortable or well-resourced transition. He arrived in Manhattan in the late 1970s with limited money, no established professional network, and a resume built entirely around a retail venture that had just failed. The fashion industry was the world he wanted to enter, but the fashion industry of that era was not an open or welcoming system for someone arriving without credentials, yet without connections, and without the kind of institutional pedigree that the established design houses respected. He found work as a freelance designer, taking whatever assignments came his way, designing for small labels and doing production work that paid modestly and carried no recognition. It was unglamorous work that required him to suppress the larger ambition he carried and focus on survival while he learned the industry from the inside. But those years in New York were not simply a waiting period. They were an education in the professional infrastructure of fashion, in how the industry actually operated at the commercial level, in the relationship between design and production and retail and marketing that determined whether a brand succeeded or disappeared. Tommy was absorbing all of it, building a map of the industry in his mind that would eventually allow him to navigate it with the confidence of someone who had spent years studying the terrain before making his move. He also developed his design sensibility more fully during this period. The counterculture influences that had shaped people's place evolved, in Tommy's thinking, into something more specifically American. A design philosophy rooted in the classic imagery of American life, the prep school and the yacht club, and the New England weekend and the 4th of July, presented not with the exclusivity of a Ralph Lauren or the formal elegance of an established luxury brand, but with a casual confidence that made those American references feel accessible and modern, rather than aspirational and remote. He was developing a point of view that was distinctly his own, and he was doing it through years of professional work that nobody paid particular attention to, because the work itself was not yet his. The turning point came through a connection that Tommy made in the early 1980s with Mohan Mirjani, an Indian textile entrepreneur who had made a significant fortune in the United States through the Gloria Vanderbilt designer jeans phenomenon of the late 1970s. Mirjani was a businessman with a sophisticated understanding of how to launch and market fashion brands, and he was looking for his next opportunity in American fashion. When he met Tommy Hilfiger and heard his vision for a brand built around classic American style with a modern, accessible sensibility, Mirjani saw exactly the kind of creative foundation he could build a business around. He agreed to finance the launch of the Tommy Hilfiger brand, providing the capital, the production infrastructure, and the business management that Tommy, as the People's Place experience had demonstrated, could not provide on his own. The launch of the Tommy Hilfiger brand in 1985 was one of the most aggressive and deliberate debut campaigns in the history of American fashion, and it was almost universally considered an act of extraordinary arrogance by the industry that Tommy was trying to enter. The strategy was conceived by George Lois, one of the most celebrated advertising minds in American history, who had spent decades producing campaigns that operated through provocation and clarity rather than conventional persuasion. Tina Lois proposed a billboard to be placed in the middle of Times Square that would present Tommy Hilfiger as an equal to the 4 greatest names in American fashion at that moment. The billboard read, "The 4 great American designers for men are R. blank L, blank Alvin blank Lane, blank Airy blank Elize, blank Ami blank Ilfiger." The blanks were meant to be filled in by the viewer, presenting Ralph Lauren, Calvin Klein, Perry Ellis, and Tommy Hilfiger as peers, before Tommy had sold a single garment under his own name. The reaction from the fashion industry was immediate and largely contemptuous. Ralph Lauren was reported to be furious. Perry Ellis's camp was dismissive. Calvin Klein's people treated it as the stunt of someone who did not understand how reputations in fashion were actually built. Industry insiders pointed out that Tommy Hilfiger had no track record as a designer under his own name, no critical recognition, no celebrity clientele, and no established retail presence, and that placing him alongside designers who had spent decades building their reputations was not a bold marketing move, but a transparent attempt to borrow credibility that had not been earned. The criticism was loud, consistent, and almost unanimous among the people who considered themselves qualified to judge such things. What those critics missed was what George Lois and Tommy Hilfiger had understood, that in fashion, perception and reality are not sequential. You do not build a reputation and then announce it. You announce it and then build it, because the announcement itself shapes how every subsequent piece of work is received. By the time consumers encountered a Tommy Hilfiger garment in a store in 1985, they had already been told by a billboard in the center of the most visible city in the world that the name belonged in the company of the greatest designers in America. That context changed how the product was experienced, and the product itself was strong enough to hold up under that context, which was the essential requirement for the strategy to work. If the clothes had been mediocre, the billboard would have accelerated the brand's failure rather than its success. Because the clothes were genuinely well designed, the billboard gave them a platform that no amount of conventional advertising could have provided. The first Tommy Hilfiger collection presented classic American sportswear with a specific and confident aesthetic. The clothes were rooted in the preppy tradition, with button-down shirts, chinos, cable-knit sweaters, and the kind of relaxed, well-constructed casual wear associated with New England summers and Ivy League campuses, but they were cut and colored with a modernity and a boldness that distinguished them from the more restrained, heritage-focused approach of Ralph Lauren. Tommy used color more aggressively, presented the classic American wardrobe with a freshness that felt contemporary rather than nostalgic, and built a brand identity that communicated both tradition and energy simultaneously. It was a specific and identifiable point of view, and it found its audience quickly. The commercial success of the early Tommy Hilfiger collections validated the billboard strategy and established the brand as a legitimate presence in the American fashion market. But the deeper foundation of what Tommy built in those years was operational rather than creative. Mohan Mirjani had provided the initial financing and business infrastructure, but by 1989 the partnership had run its course, and a new set of investors arrived who would prove even more consequential to the brand's long-term trajectory. Silas Cho, a Hong Kong-based textile magnate with deep manufacturing relationships across Asia, and Lawrence Stroll, a Canadian businessman with extensive experience in luxury brand management, acquired control of the Tommy Hilfiger brand from Mirjani in 1989 for a reported $20 million. The combination of Cho's manufacturing expertise and Stroll's brand management experience brought the Tommy Hilfiger business a level of operational sophistication that transformed it from a successful small brand into the infrastructure of a global company. Cho's connections in Asia allowed the brand to source production at a quality and scale that would have been impossible through domestic manufacturing alone, dramatically improving the brand's ability to compete on quality at a commercially viable price point. Stroll brought the kind of strategic discipline and retail partnership development that accelerated the brand's distribution across America and eventually internationally. Together, they gave Tommy Hilfiger the business machine that his creative vision required in order to reach its full potential, solving the same problem that had destroyed People's Place a decade earlier, but solving it at an entirely different scale. Tommy himself understood the importance of this partnership with a clarity that came directly from his bankruptcy experience. He was not a man who confused creative vision with operational capability because he had already paid the tuition for that confusion in Elmira. He trusted Cho and Stroll to build and manage the business infrastructure while he focused entirely on design, brand identity, and the creative direction that gave the company its reason for existing. That division of responsibility between the creative founder and the operational partners is one of the most important structural decisions in the brand's history. And it worked because all three parties understood their roles and respected the boundaries between them. In 1992, the Tommy Hilfiger Corporation went public on the New York Stock Exchange. The initial public offering valued the company at a level that would have seemed impossible to anyone who had watched Tommy file for bankruptcy 15 years earlier in Elmira. The IPO raised significant capital and gave the brand the financial resources to expand aggressively in the years that followed, opening retail locations across the United States, extending the product line into new categories, and investing in the kind of marketing and brand building activity that would carry the name into markets far beyond the American audience it had started with. On the years between the IPO in 1992 and the mid-1990s were the years that Tommy Hilfiger became genuinely inescapable in American culture. The brand's combination of classic American references and bold, colorful modernity found a remarkably broad audience, cutting across the demographic and cultural lines that most fashion brands treated as fixed boundaries. The Tommy Hilfiger aesthetic spoke simultaneously to the prep school tradition it drew from, to the mainstream middle-class consumer who wanted accessible luxury, and to younger consumers in urban markets who responded to the brand's confidence and visual boldness. That breadth of appeal was not an accident. It was the result of a design philosophy that was genuinely inclusive in its references, shoes drawing from an American visual vocabulary broad enough to resonate with many different people rather than signaling membership in a single narrow group. The flagship products that defined the brand in this period were built around the same classic American wardrobe categories that Tommy had been working with since the beginning. Polo shirts in bold color combinations featuring the Tommy Hilfiger flag logo across the chest, denim in cuts and washes that balance tradition with contemporary styling, Oxford shirts, chinos, outerwear, and knitwear, all executed with the combination of quality fabric and accessible price point that the Cho manufacturing relationships made possible. The clothes were recognizable without being ostentatious, well made without being unaffordable, and consistently on brand in a way that gave the label a coherence across its entire product range that is much harder to achieve than it appears from the outside. By the mid-1990s, Tommy Hilfiger was one of the fastest growing fashion brands in the United States, with revenues climbing year after year and a brand profile that had expanded well beyond its American origins to reach consumers in Europe and Asia, who responded to the same combination of classic American imagery and modern confidence that had built the brand at home. The company that Silas Cho and Lawrence Stroll had acquired for $20 million in 1989 had grown into a business worth several $billion, and the name on the door was the name of a boy from Elmira who had dropped out near the bottom of his high school class, filed for bankruptcy at 26, and spent years in anonymous freelance work in New York, and bet everything on a billboard that the entire fashion industry had laughed at. The Tommy Hilfiger story is, at its foundation, a story about the relationship between vision and persistence. There is no shortage of people with genuine creative vision. The fashion industry is full of people who can see clearly what they want to make and who understand with precision how clothing communicates identity and aspiration. What is rarer is the willingness to absorb failure, rebuild without bitterness, spend years in preparation that offers no guarantee of outcome, and then, when the opportunity finally arrives, execute with enough clarity and confidence that the accumulated preparation becomes visible all at once. Tommy Hilfiger did all of those things, not in the graceful, an unbroken arc of a success story told in retrospect, but through the actual experience of failure and rebuilding and waiting and trying again that those words describe. The bankruptcy of People's Place in 1977 was not a detour from Tommy Hilfiger's path. It was part of the path. The years in New York doing freelance work that nobody remembered were not wasted years. They were the years in which he learned the industry at the operational level and refined a design philosophy that was specific enough to stand for something but broad enough to reach a genuine mass audience. The decision to trust Mohan Mirjani and then Silas Cho and Lawrence Stroll with the business infrastructure of the brand was not a surrender of control. It was the application of the lesson that People's Place had taught him, like that great creative instinct requires great operational partnership, and that knowing the difference between the two is itself a form of wisdom. What Tommy Hilfiger created was not simply a clothing brand. He created a version of American style that was confident without being exclusive, rooted in tradition without being nostalgic, and accessible without being cheap. He found the space between Ralph Lauren's aristocratic aspiration and the purely commercial mainstream of American retail, and he built a brand in that space that was genuinely his own. The flag logo that appeared on tens of millions of shirts, jackets, and bags in the 1990s was not borrowed from anyone. It was the original invention of a boy from Elmira who had spent his entire life paying close attention to what clothes meant and why people chose them, and who had the courage, after everything that had gone wrong, to put his own name on a billboard in Times Square and tell the world he belonged. That is the story of Tommy Hilfiger. And if you made it to the end of this video, thank you for watching.